When a little boy gets abandoned at a wildlife reserve, a lion spots the child crying on the road. This terrifying big cat locks eyes with the little boy and lets out a fierce roar as he begins to run towards the child. What happens next is unbelievable. Scout circled the boy, whose cries were getting louder. It was early morning, and there was no one around. Scout, the huge lion, paced back and forth, the morning breeze blowing through his magnificent mane. Suddenly, he stopped and locked eyes with the little boy. The child's tear-stained cheeks were red and puffy as he looked at the big cat with watery eyes. The lion lifted his head and roared, baring his teeth in a ferocious look. On the dirt road, there was nowhere for the little boy to run. Scout roared again and stared at the child, anger flashing in his eyes. Scout had lived on the safari reserve ever since Ethan, a wildlife ranger, had rescued him as a cub. Ethan had found Scout snuggled into the lifeless body of his mother after poachers had attacked her. The cub was too young to be without a mom. So Ethan had reared the cub, getting up at all hours in the night to feed him and look after him. Ethan had worked at the reserve since he was 16, so he knew the importance of getting Scout out with other lions as soon as possible before he became too reliant on humans. The large reserve had several lion prides, and Ethan just hoped that one of the experienced moms would take Scout on as her own. So, as soon as the cub was strong enough, the ranger placed him in the care of a lioness who had just had her third cub. She was a fiercely protective mom, but one of the most gentle lionesses Ethan had ever seen, a combination that he prayed would work in Scout's favor. Thankfully, the ranger's experience had taught him well, and the lioness accepted Scout. Ethan was beyond happy with the outcome, and over the next few years, he watched as Scout grew up and separated from the pride. Male lions were solitary creatures, and leaving the safety of the pride for the first time was always dangerous. Ethan knew that Scout's chances of survival were better in the reserve, but there was still a chance he would encounter a more dominant male, and the two would fight over territory or females. The lion prides were Ethan's favorite part of working at the reserve, but he made sure to closely track Scout at all times. Having rescued him as a cub, the young ranger had a personal interest in the lion's survival, but Scout would soon do something that the ranger could never imagine. Despite his tough start in life, Scout seemed to establish himself well in the reserve. His bravery, fierce attitude, and huge size soon saw him become one of the most dominant males on the reserve. Ethan knew there had been many fights where Scout had come out on top. It wasn't nice, but it was nature, and the animals lived on the reserve as they would in the wild. The only difference being that here, they were safe from poachers, and if needed, there was a veterinary team. Ensuring the survival of the animals was important, as many were endangered species. So although Ethan did worry about Scout from time to time, he knew he was in the best place. As much as the reserve did its best to protect the animals from poachers, they'd recently experienced a few issues with hunters making their way onto the reserve. Although no animals had been hurt yet, it was now of the utmost importance to strengthen the boundaries around the reserve and stop the poachers. It was through these weakened boundaries that Scout would find himself coming face to face with a crying child. The solitary lion awoke from his slumber. The sun was rising, and the lions were the most active in the cooler parts of the day. Scout's stomach let out a low growl, and the lion lazily stretched. It was time to hunt. Finding food while not being part of a pride could be tough, but Scout seemed to manage well enough. The huge lion stood and stretched again, his giant paws reaching out in front of him. But something caused the lion to stop. A sound carried by the breeze, and an odd, familiar scent in the air caught his attention. The lion followed his senses, and suddenly, on the dirt road, he spotted an abandoned crying boy. Scout licked his lips and advanced towards the child. The little boy was sitting in the middle of the road, the hood of his blue jacket pulled up over his head. He couldn't have been more than 3 years old, and his cries were loud and distressed. The lion kept his distance but began to circle the little boy, never taking his eyes off the child. The sound was piercing, and Scout's behavior was changing by the second. The lion was now pacing back and forth, as if feeling conflicted about the situation. Suddenly, he stopped. There emerged a new scent in the air. Scout sniffed, and his hackles raised. He locked eyes with the little boy, whose face was swollen from crying. Scout let out a terrifying roar with his teeth bared. The little boy was shocked into silence. Anger seemed to fill Scout's eyes. But the child noticed the lion wasn't looking at him. He was looking over his shoulder. Suddenly, Scout charged towards the little boy and jumped over his head. A terrible thumping sound caused the little boy to turn round. Pinned on the floor was a second lion, and Scout was towering over him, roaring and swiping with his huge claws. The two lions engaged in a brief fight, but the second lion was no match for Scout. As Ethan made his way down the dirt road, unaware of the unbelievable sight that was about to greet him, the second lion struggled in an attempt to free himself from Scout's claws. The ranger rounded the corner and spotted the two lions fighting, not an unusual sight in his job. But when he saw the little boy just a few feet away from the lions, he felt sick. He had no idea how a child had gotten into the reserve, but he knew the boy was in danger. Ethan stepped down on the pedal, launching his jeep at high speed towards the boy. The second lion freed himself from Scout's weight and limped away as the larger lion roared and turned back to the child. Ethan loved Scout more than anything in the world, but if he had harmed the little boy, it would have been a disaster for the reserve. What happened next almost caused Ethan to crash his jeep in shock. The huge lion lay down next to the boy, creating a protective barrier around him as he scanned his territory to ensure nothing else could harm the child. What Ethan had just witnessed wasn't a fight between two lions over food. Scout had been protecting the child. He'd attacked the other lion to save the boy. Ethan thought back to the day he'd found Scout whimpering up against his mother's body. Had Scout seen something in the crying child that resonated with him? Whatever had happened, Ethan was amazed. The ranger really hoped he judged Scout properly, because even with the lion protecting the boy, he had to get the child out of the road and find out what had happened. If Scout wouldn't let him near the child, Ethan didn't know what he would do. Ethan cut the engine and slowly opened the jeep door. Out of all the rangers at the reserve, Ethan was the only one Scout trusted. The young ranger could spend hours watching and tracking the lion and never be bothered by him. Scout always knew he was there, but it was like he still had a memory of Ethan rescuing him that made him treat the ranger differently. Ethan just hoped that would now play in his favor. As he stepped out of the safety of his car, Scout watched as Ethan edged closer, but the huge lion wasn't in any rush to move. He looked the ranger up and down, as if assessing his trustworthiness, and with one long stretch, he stood up and strolled away. Ethan patiently waited. He passed Scout's test, and he wasn't about to ruin everything by rushing forward. When the lion was at a safe distance, Ethan scooped the child into his arms. With Scout by his side, the child seemed calm, but now that the lion was gone, the boy started crying again. Ethan had no choice but to hold onto the boy as he carefully and slowly drove back to the office. All the while, his mind was racing. Why had the boy been abandoned on the road? He was still in shock over Scout's unbelievable actions. The quickest way to try and get answers about the boy was to review the CCTV footage in the hopes it had caught something. When Ethan reviewed the CCTV from the reserve boundaries, he saw something that broke his heart. A battered old car came into view on the footage just outside the reserve boundary. Ethan could just about make out that the driver was a young man. After a few moments, a young woman climbed out of the car holding a child. She looked around quickly and then seemed to spot what she was looking for, a weakness in the fence. After a few attempts, she pushed her way through with the child and placed him on the dirt track where Ethan had seen him. The park ranger watched as the woman kissed the little boy on the forehead and then got back in the car without him. Ethan watched as the camera showed the little boy looking for his parents, but they were gone. Ethan felt more confused than ever. The forehead kiss had been tender and loving, and something told Ethan that the woman had felt like she had no choice but to abandon the little boy. But why? Inside the reserve, where he'd be in danger. Did she think the security cameras would be manned so the child would be picked up immediately? Did she think there was a ranger close by to rescue the child? The young man guessed he'd never know all the answers to his questions. He was, of course, going to do all he could to find the little boy's parents, but something told him that they were long gone. After viewing the footage, Ethan made the little boy something to eat. The child seemed to have calmed down, so the ranger decided now was a good time to try and get some information from him before he had to phone the authorities. The child looked frightened though, and the most Ethan could get from him was that his name was David. It was time to make some difficult phone calls. But as Ethan spoke to the authorities, he watched David tentatively eat his food, and he was struck by a curious thought. Ethan had rescued Scout as a young cub when his mom died, and he had just witnessed that same lion protect a young child after his parents abandoned him. It was as if things had come full circle, only this time, there would be no one to watch over the boy once he left Ethan's care, whereas Scout had always stayed with the ranger. The young man knew that desperation must have caused David's parents to leave him. Some of the villagers around the reserve were poor, and Ethan knew that taking care of a child was expensive. He thought back to the footage he'd seen of the young woman and David, desperately searching for his parents, and he was filled with sadness at what might happen to him once he left the reserve. When the authorities arrived, David was watching videos on Ethan's phone. After eating some food, the little boy perked up and kept pointing outside, saying "lion," and making a roaring noise, which the young ranger couldn't help but laugh at. Ethan quizzed the authorities on what would happen to the child. They said if they couldn't find any family members to take the child, then he would be placed in an orphanage in hopes of being adopted. It seemed like so much change and upheaval for a young child, and Ethan didn't want to think about how it would affect him. Before he could think too much about what he was doing, the young ranger volunteered to take care of the child while the authorities looked for his family. That was a crazy move. He had no experience caring for a child, but the little boy had captured his heart, much as Scout had all those years before. Just a few days later, though, Ethan received some bad news. David's family couldn't be found. The little boy would have to go to the orphanage. The young ranger stared at the boy. In such a short space of time, he'd settled in so well, and just yesterday Ethan had taken him out for a ride to see the lions. The boy had squealed with delight at the sight of cubs running around. It was magical to see the reserve that he loved so much through a fresh set of eyes. Ethan knew that later in life, David would have questions about why he'd been abandoned, and although no one could ever tell him for sure, there would be someone to tell him that his parents loved him. Someone who could tell him how a brave lion had protected him and saved his life. That person was Ethan. The young man's mind was made up. There'd be no orphanage for David. The ranger would adopt him. The next few months were difficult as Ethan went through the long adoption process to become David's legal guardian. But finally, at the end of it all, the new father and son went out for a drive to see the lions and celebrate their next chapter together. Basking in the late evening sun, not far from where David had been found, was Scout. As the jeep slowly drove by, the lion noticed a little boy looking at him through the window. Scout lazily raised his head to look at the man who had now not only rescued him but a little boy too. Ethan couldn't wait to tell his son all about Scout's story as soon as he was old enough to understand. With a rescued lion and child forming his family, the ranger's life might seem unconventional, but he wouldn't have had it any other way. Now it's over to you. What would you have done in Ethan's shoes? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.